Marcus watched as the scarecrow in the $30,000 dress struck another pose. He had never quite been able to believe how much he made just by taking a few pictures. He'd been photographing since he was very small, and it was something that he had always loved doing. His mother had a framed picture of him from when he was 2, his pull-up hanging down to reveal just a hint of backside, as he took a picture of a cardinal in their front yard with his Sesame Street camera. She liked to say that that chunky yellow camera had been the start of his whole life. "You took it everywhere with you, Mark. We finally had to hang a lanyard off of it so you could wear it around your neck and wouldn't drop it so often." The camera he was using now was probably more expensive than his mother's monthly mortgage payments. Or they would be, if he hadn't paid her house off a couple of years ago. She had been so worried about how she was going to pay it off after his dad had died, and it hadn't been that much in the end. Marcus was glad to do it for her. His mother had always been his biggest fan, and the biggest supporter of his work. Whether it was the fridge door or the cover of Vanity Fair, she was always there. Marcus blinked as he took the next picture, pulling the camera back a little as he looked over the display screen in the real world. "Something wrong, Marky?" asked Sandra, glancing around like Marcus might have seen something on the set. Marcus licked his lips, rolling back to the last photo and checking the picture. He could have sworn he'd seen something, some dark smudge or something, but it was probably just a flash burn. Little spotting was a normal price to pay for success, but that had been strange indeed. He'd seen the spot before, but never like that. "Nothing, Sandy. I think we got enough for today. These are going to look great on your spread for Cosmo next month." Sandra laughed, walking daintily so she didn't stumble coming off the set and damage her offensively expensive dress. "For the price, they better be," she said, lifting her arms so he could unzip her. "Hey, those are friend prices. Imagine what I charge for people I don't like." She laughed, slipping the check into his shirt pocket. "Can't believe the most sought-after photographer in L.A. dresses like someone's dad out for a day at the beach." She shook her head as she said it, as if Marcus was committing the most heinous offense by just existing. Marcus looked down at his khaki cargo shorts and his polo shirt. He didn't see anything wrong with them. They were timeless, they were comfortable, and they reminded him of his Uncle Sean. Uncle Sean had given him his first real camera and had shown him how to get the best shots. Uncle Sean was a wildlife photographer, and Marcus wished he had the guts that man had. He supposed that starlets could be just as likely to eviscerate you as a lioness, but the biting remarks usually left less trauma behind. "I like them," Mark said. "They look more comfortable than that thing." She folded the garment delicately across her arm, chuckling at him as she reached for her garment bag. "True, but this is fashion, and fashion is always worth a little discomfort." Marcus followed her out. Sandra was his last client for the day, and he wanted to close up shop so he could do something a little less flashy for a while. He stopped before turning the lights off on the set, though. Something had scuttled across his nerves, and he was looking for the source of the noise. Had it been laughter? It had to be Sandra, the echo of her chuckle, but this had sounded different. This was like that awful laughter you heard in the sitcom, the kind that made him want a mute button, just for the sound. "Coming?" Sandra asked, standing by the door to his studio as she lingered there. "Yeah," he said, clicking the switch and heading out behind her. "I don't know how you do it, Mark," Sandra said as she went through the pictures. "You're the only straight guy I've ever met with an eye for style like this." They were at Rogers, a bar they frequented, though the owner would likely harumph if he heard them call the place a bar. There were no pool tables or jukeboxes at Rogers. It was as far from the honky-tonks that Marcus had grown up drinking in as McDonald's was from Olive Garden. Rogers was a trendy place, a place to be seen and see people. Rogers was a place to get a cosmopolitan with your friends. but the fact that Marcus could drink a draft beer let him know that the owner was no fool. Roger wanted a trendy spot, but he also wanted to make money. Marcus snorted into his beer. I don't know if I'd call myself straight, per se. I've never really been interested in anyone, or anything but photography. Sandra flapped a hand at him. Nonsense! What about Bridget? You two dated for nearly 3 years. Marcus shrugged. We were more friends than anything. Bridget just hated to be alone, and I liked having someone home besides Samson. Sandra tittered a little, and it made his skin crawl. Did you see who she's engaged to? He's pretty enough, but if brains were black powder, he couldn't blow his nose. They'll make some pretty babies, though, I'm sure. Marcus made a non-committal sound and took a sip from his bottle. Sandra always seemed to want to talk gossip, but Marcus found it a little tiring. He was sure that she and her friends speculated that Marcus had some man or some woman that he didn't talk about, but Marcus had been honest when he said that he'd never been into anything except photography. Oh, there had been crushes when he was younger, but he had tired of intimacy pretty quickly. One didn't become the leading photographer to the stars without a lot of hard work, and his status as a certified bachelor often helped him get a leg up on the competition. Okay, Sandra said, rolling her eyes. You really are no fun. Guess who happened to be at Sarah Grayson's Easter brunch last week? I'm sure you'll tell me, Marcus said, eyes scanning the crowd for potential clients. Darby Wheeler, she sing-songed, and she grinned when Marcus turned his full attention to her. The maestro for the Gardenia? No, the maestro for the town dump. Yes, the head organizer for the Gardenia. The Gardenia was as far from Rogers as it got. The Gardenia was thought of as a club, but it was so much more. The Gardenia was a nightclub, an art gallery, a concert venue, an impromptu gathering space for the city's richest and most influential, and elements that were so abstract that you couldn't give them a name. Only the best were invited to the Gardenia, and Marcus had been trying to gain an invitation for years. The first page of their clients list could set him up for the rest of his career, and Marcus suspected that Sandra might have his in. Well, as luck would have it, Sarah set me beside him, and we struck up a conversation. Seems he's just fired as personal photographer for some indiscretion. Sandra tapped the side of her nose when she said it, and he's looking to replace him. Please, Marcus practically begged as he leaned across the table and took her hand. Please tell me you just happened to have some of my photos I took, your summer Levy spread, or something you could show him. She smiled like an imp with a soul on the line. Just so happens I had the ones you took for my Corman Winter show. He was very impressed. That really was some of your best work, Marky. And, Marcus prompted, squeezing her hand but trying not to crush it, he said he wanted to see more. He's expecting your portfolio on his desk, and I wouldn't dilly-dally. Some lucky photographer is going to get the job of a lifetime, and it really should be you. He released her hand, feeling a mixture of elation and dread settle over him. Darby Wheeler, this really was the opportunity of a lifetime. Not only could Darby set him up with the Gardenia, but he could get him into every event the Gardenia hosted. His work would likely be displayed in their newsletters, on their website, even in their gallery if he submitted it. This was huge. Darby didn't pay less than 5 figures for dress socks, and God knew what his personal photographer made. Marcus had to grab his bottle as he stood up, shaking the table in his haste. Careful, Sandra shrilled, grabbing her own drink. I want to sip this, not wear it. I got to get my portfolio together. I got to find my best shots, the perfect spread. Sandra laughed. Settle down, Marky. He won't give the job away overnight. It's Friday, and the old man won't even be in the office till Monday. You can... Then it needs to be perfect by then, Marcus said, finishing the beer in a single long pull and heading for the door. Sandra sniffed, looking a little miffed, before he returned suddenly to kiss her cheek. Have I told you lately how much I love you? She grinned. No, but a girl never gets tired of hearing it, so feel free to say it more often. Marcus put his head in his hands as he went through his portfolio. Nothing here was good enough to present to someone like Darby Wheeler. He'd done all manner of events, catwalk shows, celebrity photo shoots, but Darby had probably seen all this before. He needed something new, something different from the rest. Everything here, even the stuff that the others had raved about, seemed so bland and uninspired. What did he have that would set him apart? He jumped suddenly, a sound raking across his nerves. He looked at the TV, trying to see if he'd left it on, but the flat screen was dark, and the remote was laid neatly on the coffee table, where it always was. Still, he walked over to it, just to be sure. The sound had been very distinct, the laugh track for some network schlock that wasn't funny enough for a live audience. Marcus didn't watch shows like that. They just didn't hold his interest, but the sound of that canned laughter had definitely been what he'd heard. He looked at the TV like it might suddenly turn on, but as it stayed dark and quiet, he went back to the desk. His studio apartment made the trip nothing too rigorous, and Marcus liked the Spartan space that he'd made his own. He had folded screens around his bed, a corner for his free weights with rubber mats over the hardwood, and a small kitchen area where he did a lot of cooking and reheating. Marcus had wrapped his hand around the back of the chair, preparing to draw it out, when he heard the same mechanical chortle and turned back to the living room. He had never really thought about it, but the sound made him intensely angry for some reason. It felt like, in this case, he was the joke, and whatever was making that noise was laughing at him. Marcus didn't like to be laughed at. Made him feel small again. Marcus's childhood hadn't been untouched by strife, as any kid who grew up with a love of photography could tell you. It had gotten better in high school, his pictures at sporting events really standing out in the school paper or the yearbook, but Marcus had still contended with bullies. The bullies didn't care that he was a gifted photographer. They didn't care that he was better at 12 than they would ever be, that he would live a rich life that they could only dream of one day. They only knew he was different, and they hated him for that difference. The laughter came again, and suddenly it sounded like Freddie Hinkle, a kid who'd been dead for about 10 years now, after a motorcycle accident. "Nice camera, Gaylord. Gotta go take a spread of the men's swim team for later?" Marcus furrowed his brow, wondering what the source of this was. He shut the windows, thinking maybe it was something from outside. "Ooh, look guys, little Marky's gonna go take some pictures of the baseball team. Don't forget the crotch shots." Marcus was breathing heavily, looking around fitfully, feeling like a trapped animal. Where was this coming from? Marcus hadn't thought about this in years. Freddie, Jack, Levi, even Eddie, who had gone to college with him. He hadn't seen any of them in years. No one besides Sandra called him Marky anymore, but it seemed these ghosts, or whatever they were, didn't know that. He didn't know what was going on, but he felt ice rolling down his spine as he looked around his empty apartment. "Let's see what you got on this camera. Probably shots from the elementary school playground." He felt their hands on him, holding him down as they took what was most precious to him. "Flowers, trash, shit, there isn't anything good on here, man. You're so boring." Marcus gripped the waist of his jeans, knowing it would do no good. "Let's give him something more interesting to look at." Marcus crumbled to the floor, shaking as he tried to push the trauma away. He had lived his whole life trying to distance himself from that scared sophomore boy who had done nothing but hang between the two bigger boys as the third one used something so precious to him to violate him in a way far more intimate than anything he'd ever experienced. They had beaten him afterwards, taking more photos, and left him weeping in the dirt behind the gym for the girls' softball team to stumble across 10 minutes later. Some had laughed, but Marcus thought that a lot of them could tell something terrible had happened here. They had kept the camera when they were done, and when his father had gone to the principal to have it returned, he had forbidden him to talk about the abuse. No sense muddying the waters, Mark. The important thing is the camera, yes? Well, let's get it back then. That was the worst part. Not the bullying, not the photos, not even having his camera taken. The worst part was his father's disbelief. He didn't want to believe that someone could do something like that to his son, would rather sweep it under the rug than believe it. So he told himself that Marcus was just blowing it out of proportion. He could defend the victims of sexual assault in the courtroom, but he couldn't believe that his son had been the victim of anything more substantial than some horseplay gone too far. Freddie had come in looking contrite, his father's hand on his shoulder looking like an iron manacle. The camera was fine, a little scratched, but still fine. It appeared that Freddie had realized what he had, and hadn't quite been willing to damage it as he had damaged the owner. He also likely realized what he had done with said camera, because the film had been gone when he handed it back to Mark with a half-hearted sorry. Marcus's father hadn't wanted to say anything in front of the principal, but he had stopped Freddie's dad on the way out and told him how it was going to be. Marcus's father was a defense attorney, a paper pusher, who weighed about 180 pounds soaking wet. Freddie's dad was a steel worker, his bare arms looking like someone had put cigarettes out on them when he was off the clock. But he had gathered the weight of what Marcus's father was telling him, and that iron grip became steel. I trust this is the last time we will need to talk about this. Your son likely has some sort of future before him, and if anyone discovered what he and his friends were doing to Marcus, then it could raise quite a few questions about the sort of man he might become. Marcus's old man had stood tall as a lion that day, and Frankie's father looked like he wanted nothing more than to warm up on Marcus's dad before beating the tar out of his son. Let me assure you, Mr. Grayson, this is the last time your boy will have any trouble with my boy. Marcus saw Frankie wince as the fingers of that hand dug into his collarbone. If it ain't, you call me, and I'll reiterate the talk we're gonna have when we get home. Frankie'd come to school the next day with a shiner and a limp, and he had never been closer to Marcus than to say "excuse me" on the stairs again. Marcus could still remember the hate that burned in those eyes any time he saw him, but he never approached him again, and soon his friends left Marcus alone too. Marcus opened his eyes, realizing he was on his knees on the hardwood of the apartment. What the hell had that been? A panic attack? A mental meltdown? Marcus didn't know, but as he stood up, he heard that rustle of laughter again, and no longer felt as safe in his apartment as he usually did. He grabbed his laptop and his coat, remembering to scoop up his phone as he walked to the door. He would go to the studio, he would get his work done, and he would assemble his portfolio, and he would get the hell out of here. The chuckling seemed to follow him all the way into the hallway, but it seemed to leave him alone as the door to his studio closed behind him. Are you sure you're okay? Marcus shook his head, trying to orient himself as he took the shot. Even at his worst, the shot was still perfect, and Marcus had to marvel at the way his muscle memory came into play. His shots were spot on, his delivery perfect, and as he reached for his espresso, he knew it was the mind that ran the talented hands that was failing. He had worked until first light, finally slumping over his desk as he finished the portfolio. When his phone had rung at about 9:30, he had come shakily awake to see it was the alarm to remind him of his 10 o'clock appointment. He had just enough time to get the studio ready and rush down to Casterly's for a cup of something strong and dark. The triple shot of espresso was bitter, but it was helping him to stay upright as he finished the shoot with little Miss No-Name. Miss Up-and-Comer here had a rich daddy, though, and Marcus needed to pay the bills. Yes, ma'am. I'm not about to let a late night get in the way of your order. Marcus blinked rapidly, not sure he had seen what he thought he had. It was something in the far corner, a dark thing that was down on all fours, but as he looked now, It was gone. He jumped. It was closer now. It had been about 15 feet from the wall. 15 feet from little Miss No-Name, who was primping in her salmon prom dress. She looked like a knick-knack that someone had freshly polished, a sparkling ornament to mediocrity, but Marcus supposed this was the best she could find for the shoot. Who knew? Maybe she thought it looked fancy. She was looking at him strangely, probably suspected he was on drugs or something, and when Marcus lifted the camera again, he felt his hands shaking. The monster was right behind her, its grinning face preparing to bite as Marcus bellowed out a warning. "Look out!" he said. When he heard the angry crunch of glass, he realized he had dropped his camera. He was holding a hand out, reaching for her, but the monster was gone. "What are you talking about?" she said, spinning in terror as if expecting to find something lurking behind her. Marcus glanced around, not sure where it had gone, but he realized that his client likely wouldn't be back after this. One of the best or not, he didn't get return business scaring the crap out of girls who were barely out of high school. "Nothing," he said, his tongue sliding over his lips. "I thought I saw something, but I must have been mistaken. Please, let me get you to have a seat in the green room while I get the samples ready. Help yourself to an Evian water, and I believe there might be some sashimi in there if you're feeling peckish." That seemed to brighten her mood a little, and he had no doubt that the girl would snarf the sashimi that he had brought for lunch the day before. Whatever, he thought as he went to check his camera. Her father would pay him enough to buy a sushi boat if he wanted it. He was more worried about his camera, and he was afraid of what he would find when he checked it out. He was relieved to discover that it was only the attached lens that had a crack, a single jagged bolt that ran from corner to corner. The camera itself looked undamaged. That was good, because Marcus wasn't really looking forward to replacing a camera today. He bristled as he heard that chuckle again, the same rankling laughter that had assaulted him in his apartment. Were these creatures the one who had stalked him there? Marcus lifted the camera, his hands shaking as he snapped a picture. In the flash, he saw the grinning face of the creature as it hunkered inches from his, just waiting to pounce. Its teeth were bared, its grin most fearsome, and Marcus scuttled back on his backside as he tried to get away. The creature was flash-burned onto his eyes, the image frozen there by his fear. He snapped another, the flash going off like a bomb, and the creature hadn't moved an inch. The problem was, now there were two of them. The second had been crouched on the stage, right behind where the girl had stood moments before. They were both hunched creatures with skin that seemed to pulsate like black water at the bottom of a well. They had no eyes, none that he could see, but their faces appeared mostly taken up by teeth. They had their eyeless heads pointed at him, their teeth gleaming in the flash of the camera, and when he flashed a third time, he felt a scream hang in his throat like a chicken bone. There were more each time he popped the flash. "Excuse me, Mr. Grayson, are you okay?" Marcus turned his head, and he must have looked about as feral as the creatures who had startled him. The man, a suited fellow who looked like he planned his bowel movements ahead of time, stepped back in surprise. He put a hand up as if he might need to defend himself, and Marcus sighed as he fixed himself up a little. "My sincerest apologies, Mr. Foster," he said, getting up as he closed the door to the studio behind him. "I took a bad step and ended up falling down. You'll forgive me for startling you. I'm so embarrassed." Mr. Foster nodded, offering him a hand, which Marcus shook. "Quite all right. Nothing to be embarrassed about. I'm looking for my daughter. She had an appointment at 10. Yes, of course," Marcus said with a nod. "She's in the green room. Please help yourself to an Evian." Mr. Foster nodded, smiling as he headed off to the little room that Marcus kept for clients. Marcus took one more look at the door to the studio, locking it for good measure before heading into his office. It was time to get to work. Absolutely astounding, Mr. Foster said, swiping through the shots of his daughter as she munched happily on tuna and rice. Marcus bowed his head, accepting the compliment as Mr. Foster swiped through the photos. To Marcus, it looked pretty average, but he knew it would look amazing to anyone who didn't do this on a daily basis. The girl had done little more than glance at them, being much more interested in the remains of his lunch and the flat screen that hung in the green room. She was watching TMZ almost loud enough to cover the sound of her smacking, but not quite. Marcus thought she already had the attitude of a starlet, so he supposed she was halfway there. Marcus heard the sound of tearing perforation and looked up to find Mr. Foster holding out a check. "With a little extra," he said covertly, "for the buffet." "Oh, you don't," Marcus said, but the man was pressing the check into his hand with a grin. "It's my pleasure. You do amazing work, young man. Come along, Clarice. Your tennis instructor is waiting for you, and we still have to get you changed." She whined a little on the way out, but Mr. Foster was insistent as he let her out. He thanked Marcus again, the two shaking hands, as he told him that they would definitely be back if she needed more photos for her portfolio. Marcus watched them go, preparing to walk back inside when he saw a strange individual making his way towards the studio. The audacious figure looked like he had straddled the line between an upscale pimp and a shabby don. He wore a pinstripe suit with a matching bowler hat, a pair of oversized driving glasses blocking out the sun that the hat failed to get. He wore alligator shoes that clashed with his suit badly, and a fur cloak that made him look like some sort of ancient king who was very likely sweltering in the early summer heat. The sound of his cane, as it talked on the concrete, reminded him of the birds around their home when he was a kid, the ones who smashed snails in the garden wall for tasty treats that lay within. "Marcus Grayson?" the man asked, his voice rich and cultured with just the slightest hint of a European accent. Yes, sir, but it's appointment only, and..." "Oh, I'm not here for pictures, son. I'm Darby Wheeler, and I've spent all morning being told how I just must meet you. May I come in? It's very hot out here, but fashion requires a certain amount of suffering." Marcus was speechless. Darby Wheeler, at his studio. "Marcus, I said a certain amount of suffering. If you leave me out here much longer, you will need a snow shovel to clean me up." Marcus snapped out of it, apologizing as he showed him inside. He started to take him to the studio, but instead he brought him to his office. The green room still smelled of sushi and Midwestern dreams, and he was afraid that it would offend Darby's sensibility. His office was a little cluttered, but it would be easier to conduct business there. "So, what brings a man of your stature to my humble studio?" "Oh, fate, destiny, or more likely it was the constant stream of compliments from your friend Sandra Neesmith. She's quite fond of you, and if you were thinking of proposing, I would do so before she bursts." Marcus laughed, almost certain that he had guessed who had facilitated this. "She and I were seated near each other at today's Citizen of the Arts delegation, and she gushed the whole time about your work and how much of an asset you would be to my projects, and on and on and on. I ignored her for the first half hour, but after 2 or 3 hours of listening to her tout your praises, I had to come and have a look for myself. I must say you are very humble." He indicated Marcus's jeans and ratty t-shirt. "But I am aware of the eccentricities of your breed. So show me your work and let's see what all the fuss is about." Marcus could have kissed Sandra and strangled her at the same time. She could have warned him, could have let him prepare for what was coming. As it stood, he had only what he had pieced together the night before, and as he pulled the tablet off the table and scrolled through the appropriate collection, he felt mighty unprepared. He had grabbed his best, the best of the best, the pictures that stood out to him as worthy, but it all seemed so pointless now. Had he thought these were good, he wondered? Had he really thought they were the best he had to offer? As Darby scrolled through them, Marcus felt his stomach fluctuate. It was all so shallow. Why had he shown him these? They were all so common, so mundane, so... "Your friend did not lie, it seems," Darby said, nodding his head as his eyes stared eagerly from behind those thick glasses. "You have a gift, boy. If the last photographer I had on retainer had been half as good as you, he could have done all the blow he wanted. Do you have any such proclivities? Are you a doper, a boozer, addicted to medications?" Marcus shook his head. "No, sir. I enjoy a drink, but rarely to excess. I haven't done drugs since college, and then it was just a little weed. As for medication, I have some muscle relaxers in my medicine cabinet, but I only use them when I have a spasm." Darby quirked an eyebrow, and Marcus saw they were cut very aggressively. "Are you a sex pest? Perhaps you have a proclivity for children or animals?" Marcus wanted to be offended by the question, but he found himself shaking his head instead. "No, sir, I have a sneaking suspicion I might be an asexual, but I've never given it much thought. The work has been the only thing I've ever been attracted to. I love being a photographer, and it's what I've always wanted to do. It's the only real skill I ever had, to my father's chagrin, and it's all I ever wanted." Darby was nodding, but he still hadn't put away the eyebrow. "Word of advice, kid. Develop some vices. No one trusts anyone in this scene who hasn't found a skeleton or two in their closet. I won't lie, though, it would be nice to have someone on my crew I didn't have to worry about having to bail out of jail for a DUI or crime of a particular nature. I think I'd like to give you a chance, Mr. Grayson." As he spoke, he had been fishing a contract out of his pocket, complete with a fancy silver pen. "That is, if you'd like to have a chance taken on you." Marcus didn't have to think about it very hard, but he made himself slow down before signing his life away. Let me have a look at this, Mr. Wheeler, and I'll bring it by tomorrow if the terms are acceptable." Darby cackled and smacked Marcus on the shoulder. "Not a complete fool, either. Yes, I think we're going to get along very well." He said his goodbyes, leaving Marcus to read over the contract. Marcus, however, could barely contain his excitement. He had done it. He was in. He was going to work with Darby Wheeler. He was going to be the photographer for the events at the Gardenia. He honestly didn't care if this contract indentured him to that crazy old man for the rest of his life, he reflected as he laughed long and hard. He had arrived. His time had come. He was drunk as a lord, and he wasn't sure if he was holding Sandra up or she was holding him up. They had started to take a cab back to his place, but the thought of hearing those whispers from so long ago had sobered him up. He told the cabbie to drop him off at his studio instead. Sandra had laughed. "You sleeping at work now?" she slurred, leaning against him. "Got some new nosy neighbors," he said, sounding unconvincing, even to himself. He invited her in, but she declined, saying that she'd grab a cab home. "I want to get comfy and drink a jug of water, order something greasy from DoorDash, and take either the food or the driver to bed, depending on which one is less greasy," she joked. Marcus paid for the cab, tipping hugely, and waved as she sped off for home. He was through the doors when he remembered the laughter and the creature from earlier. Maybe he should have gone back to his apartment after all, but he would have rather dealt with a whole herd of monsters if it meant he didn't have to hear the voice of his bullies again. He could still feel their hands as they stripped him, the humiliation of being photographed as he lay naked in the dirt, the pain as they beat him. The memories were burning the alcohol out of him, and he stumbled to his office so he could pass out before it was completely gone. When he got there, he was greeted by something that didn't make any sense right away. Someone had torn up the contract that Darby had left him. On the pieces, in what appeared to be red ink, they had written "refused" and "under contract." The words blurred a little as he tried to make sense of them, and the lines kept separating and coming back together as if a drunken mind was trying to force it to make sense. At the bottom, near the signature line, someone had signed Little Marky, and beside it they had written Child Photo Star. Marcus was breathing raggedly, his liquor-soaked brain trying to make it make sense. That's when he heard the laughter. It was louder now, no laugh track from another room, and as Marcus came out of his office, his hands scrambled for something that he could use as a weapon. They found the camera with the cracked lens instead, and Marcus held it to his chest like a talisman as he stepped into the hallway between the studio and the rest of his office. "Who's there?" Marcus asked, his voice sounding far from sure, and when the door to the studio slid open, he heard his teeth chatter. "Marky," came a whisper from the studio, and Marcus felt the hair stand up on the back of his neck. "Who's there?" he bellowed, taking a shaking step towards the door. "Come on, Marky," croaked the rotted voice of his long-ago bully. "Don't keep us waiting. We just want to take a few pictures." He stumbled to the studio, little as he wanted to. Most of the drunken revelry had burned away now, and he was left with only the heavy tar of dread within him. He walked into the studio on legs that weren't his own and found a familiar scene waiting before him. There were 4 mannequins on the stage. 2 of them gathered around a third as the 4th took pictures with a familiar Sesame Street camera. The mannequins were smiling, all but the one on the ground, and Marcus couldn't help but notice that this one was the only one without clothes on as well. The mannequin on the ground wasn't just smiling. He wore an ear-to-ear grin that showed off more teeth than a mannequin had any business to have. "Who's there?" Marcus yelled. When the lights went out, he was left with nothing but his own ragged breathing. Marcus poked his foot around blindly, trying to orient himself as he froze when he heard the sound of scuttling hands and digging claws. Without thinking, he engaged the flash. They were behind the 4 on the stage, their numbers growing like a wave of tar behind it. The collection of creatures seemed endless, a rising tide of tar beings, and Marcus was backtracking at a jog as the flash dissipated and he was left in darkness again. He didn't want to see them, but his mind needed to know. It was like a man in the depths of a cave, lighting matches just to remember what fire looked like. The tide was rising before him, and as the lights went out again, Marcus was sobbing silently from the wall of the studio. He couldn't find the door, he couldn't find an escape, and his mind still screamed to have the flash. It would kill him, he knew this, but he was a creature of the light. He needed to know, even if the knowledge was something he died for. But he pushed back against it. He began to slide along the wall, looking for the door, but he wasn't as careful as he thought. When the camera slipped from his hand, the shatter of breaking glass was coupled with a sudden flash of light. The black wave rolled over him, and as he was pulled beneath it, he heard a syrupy voice that echoed in his pounding head. "Finally, we have someone to properly commemorate our masterpiece."